The EHRC isn't fit for purpose. Not only does an organisation that was created to uphold the rights of marginalised people in the UK fail to do so on a routine basis, but said organisation has, in fact, become a source of terror for many, particularly trans people. Though before we discuss things further, I just need to give a quick content warning for the following: transphobia, misogyny, racism, suicide, and genocide. If you like our work, please consider supporting the channel via Patreon. You can also support us by liking, commenting, and sharing this video on social media. Hey there, my name is Apple Thurston, she, her, they, them, and it's time we talk about the recent EHRC proposals to change the Equality Act's definition of sex, how that has stripped trans people of their human rights, and how things got so bad in the first place. Though to understand the extent of what is happening, we must first understand both the Gender Recognition Act of 2004 and the Equality Act of 2010. The Gender Recognition Act of 2004 was created to give trans people the means of obtaining a Gender Recognition Certificate, or GRC, a document that is needed to change the gender marker on someone's birth certificate, tax forms, pension forms, and marriage certificate. Contrary to popular belief, a GRC is not required to change a person's ID, such as their passport or driver's license, with said documents requiring a legal declaration of an individual's true gender, often known as self-ID. That said, a GRC is still sought by many trans people who do not wish to be routinely misgendered or even outed as trans anytime they require said documents. Sadly, the current gender recognition process is dehumanizing, requiring a trans person to go before a gender recognition panel to supply evidence that proves that they have been living as their declared gender for 2 years, a process that is tied to incredibly outdated and sexist notions of what gender means. For example, a trans woman having a preference for trousers over dresses can and is presented as evidence that they lack conviction in being a woman. Naturally, most people would be appalled if the same standard were applied to cis women by a medical institution, hence the call for gender recognition reform to replace the gender recognition panel with legal declaration, so self-ID. The UK had a nationwide consultation on said proposed changes in 2018, with the results finding that an overwhelming majority of UK citizens, that is 78.6%, were in favour of removing the requirement for individuals to provide evidence of having lived as their declared gender for a period of time, with the results being even higher among those who actually understood the impact said changes would have. It's also worth noting that an independent poll conducted in 2020 found that cis women are more likely to support said changes than men. Sadly, the then acting Minister for Women and Equalities, Liz Truss, buried the report, stalling its publishing for as long as possible as anti-trans bigots continue to muddy the waters in order to try and prevent the changes from going through, a plan that seems to have worked. Scotland, meanwhile, has had 2 independent consultations on top of the overall UK one ending in 2018 and another ending in 2020, both of which found strong support for the proposed changes, including by cis women, leading to the passing of the Gender Recognition Reform Bill by Scottish Parliament towards the end of 2022. Sadly, the UK government blocked said bill's royal assent earlier this year, using Section 35 for the first time in history to undemocratically veto the bill. It is currently unknown whether the newly elected First Minister of Scotland, Humza Yousaf, will fight said veto in court at the time of recording, though do check the top of the video description for updates as that's likely to change in the coming days. Moving on to the Equality Act of 2010, said act was introduced to expand upon pre-existing anti-discrimination laws, adding guidelines to protect the human and civil rights of trans people housed under the category Gender Reassignment. The Equalities and Human Rights Commission, or EHRC, would play a key role in its introduction, publishing guidelines that helped businesses with the day-to-day interpretation of said law. One particular aspect the EHRC helped explain was how sex-based services could not issue a blanket ban on trans people, guaranteeing trans folk access to gendered or single-sex spaces and services in line with their declared gender. Spaces and services including, but not limited to, bathrooms, changing rooms, refuges, and rape crisis centres. I want to repeat myself to make this absolutely clear. Trans people have had legally guaranteed access to these spaces and services since 2010. The EHRC also made clear that, in spite of trans people being housed under gender reassignment, said protections are not reliant on medical procedure or obtaining a GRC, with the EHRC's very own website stating, quote, "To be protected from gender reassignment discrimination, you do not need to have undergone any medical treatment or surgery to change from your birth sex to your preferred gender. You can be at any stage in the transition process, from proposing to reassign your sex, undergoing a process of reassignment, or having completed it. It does not matter whether or not you have applied for or obtained a gender recognition certificate, which is the document that confirms the change of a person's legal sex." End quote. Which makes sense when you think about it. None of the documents which require a GRC are legal ID, with birth certificates even having a stamp that states very plainly that they are not proof of identity. This means there is no theoretical way to limit a trans person's access to gender spaces on the basis of whether or not they have a GRC, at least not under current law. So the main takeaway from this is the fact that trans people's access to gendered and single-sex spaces is legally guaranteed under the Equality Act and is not reliant on them obtaining a GRC, meaning gender recognition reform would in no way impact said access, a fact that will continue to be highly relevant throughout this video. Which brings us to the EHRC's descent into anti-trans hate. The Equality and Human Rights Commission was originally founded by Labour in 2007 to be a non-departmental public body that would assess and advise both the government and the public on matters relating to equality. That is why they played a central role in introducing the Equality Act, leading them to be viewed as generally supportive of the LGBT+ community, including trans people during the 2010s. This all changed, however, when Liz Truss, then acting Minister for Women and Equalities, appointed Baroness Kishore-Faulkner to the role of EHRC chair in December of 2020. This was not a neutral act, a fact that can be understood when we consider how, during her time as Minister for Women and Equalities, Liz Truss went on record stating that she wished to abolish the Women and Equalities office she was assigned to in order to replace it with the Ministry of Freedom. This acts as a real-life example of 1984-style doublespeak, with the vague usage of freedom in said title standing for corporate and legal freedom to discriminate against marginalized people, as opposed to an individual's freedom to be judged without prejudice. Liz Truss has a particular disdain for trans people, and so Baroness Kishore-Faulkner, a fellow anti-trans bigot, was a natural fit for the role. Her being assigned to the position was a political means of destroying said body's desire and thus capability to hold Liz Truss to account on her anti-equality crusade, helping drive her anti-trans agenda forward. This led former EHRC chair, David Isaac, to publicly condemn the move, stating that, quote, "My view is that an independent regulator shouldn't be in a position where the governments of the day can actually influence the appointments of that body to support a particular ideology." End quote. Sadly, the appointment went through, and Baroness Faulkner quickly set to work undermining the human rights of trans people. In April of 2021, the Baroness pressured the EHRC to become involved when John Lewis, a UK department store, adopted gender-neutral fitting rooms, with a former EHRC employee stating, quote, "Faulkner was furious about John Lewis letting down women," end quote, with another adding, quote, "She was being transphobic. The team just wants to exclude trans people more," end quote. Another source, still working at the EHRC as of 2022, stated that, in relation to the poor quality of reports coming out at the time, that, quote, "The leadership team aren't worried about that. They just want organizations to know that they won't be sued for being transphobic," end quote. Faulkner was later convinced to drop the issue until the EHRC's new position had been published. Then, in January of 2022, Baroness Faulkner started the year by writing a letter to the Scottish Parliament, warning them against introducing changes to its gender recognition process on vague grounds of concerns for women. In her letter, the Baroness resorted to the use of disinformation, implying that the proposed changes would impact trans people's access to single-sex spaces, when, as explained earlier, said access was already guaranteed under the Equality Act more than a decade prior. On top of this, many saw the Tory-appointed EHRC to be overextending in attempting to dictate Scottish law, in spite of the results of 2 independent consultations proving overwhelming support by cis women for the proposals, meaning the EHRC was not speaking on behalf of the people, but rather against them. Just over a week later, in February of 2022, it was revealed by Vice News that Baroness Faulkner had been meeting in secret with anti-trans hate groups such as Fair Play for Women and the LGB Alliance. Baroness Faulkner even went so far as to give said hate groups the ability to contact her directly, a privilege not extended to any major women's or LGBT+ group. It also came to light that fellow EHRC leader, Alasdair Henderson, had pushed the EHRC to intervene in the Mayor Forstater case the year prior. Mayor Forstater had been working as a consultant for the Centre for Global Development, that is until she decided to make comments disparaging trans people to the extent of creating a hostile and degrading work environment, a fact raised internally, leading to her contract no longer being renewed when it ran out. Ms. Forstater challenged the non-renewal at the Central London Employment Tribunal, arguing that her intolerance of trans people was protected under the Equality Act. That's the very same Equality Act created to protect trans people from that very thing, and was naturally thrown out of court. That's when the EHRC stepped in, not to reaffirm the safety of trans people in the workplace, but to support Ms. Forstater as she went on to appeal the ruling, successfully getting it overturned in no small part, thanks to their help. It therefore came as little surprise when Vice News later revealed that EHRC staff were leaving the organisation in droves due to the open transmisia, with some going so far as to accuse Baroness Faulkner of editing case studies to better fit her transmisic agenda. That is how dedicated she and her team were to harming trans people, that they'll flat out fabricate evidence. Vice News then published a third and final article, this time regarding documents suggesting that the EHRC was looking to ban trans people from public bathrooms unless they held a GRC, a move that would be in direct violation of the Equality Act. This led Stonewall and a number of other leading LGBT+ charities to call for an international review of the EHRC, with the group submitting a 19-page document detailing the EHRC's failure to uphold and defend a standard of dignity and equality for LGBT+ residents. During this period, Holyrood reporter Mandy Rhodes asked the Baroness whether she was transphobic, a question she responded to by stating, quote, "I don't know what the meaning of that word is," end quote. Putting aside the clear transmisia evidence over the last 5 minutes, pretending like that doesn't exist, surely we should expect the chair of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission to have a working understanding of transphobia. I can't be the only one who thinks that this, if not displaying clear ill intent in lying, at least displays a degree of incompetence that makes Baroness Faulkner unfit for office. Things only continue to get worse, however, as further leaks towards the end of 2022 suggested that the EHRC was getting ready to amend the Equality Act's definition of sex and gender in order to explicitly exclude trans people. This led to the creation of a petition on the 15th of November 2022, calling upon the British government to commit to protecting the current definition. Said petition passed 10,000 signatures in January, prompting an official response from the UK government, which read, quote, "This government believes in individual liberty. There are processes with appropriate checks to allow for those who wish to legally change their gender. Changes to the Equality Act are not necessary." End quote. Okay, that's great. We have written confirmation that changes to the Equality Act are not necessary. So we can rest now, right? Right? Well, no. As you might have guessed, the government was lying. On the 4th of April, just 4 days after Trans Day of Visibility, the EHRC made a post stating, quote, "We have provided advice to the Minister for Women and Equalities on the definition of the protected characteristic of sex in the Equality Act 2010, end quote. The tweet linked a page on the EHRC's website titled, "Clarifying the definition of sex in the Equality Act," explaining how, on the 21st of February, the new Minister for Women and Equalities, Kemi Badenoch, reached out to the EHRC for, quote, advice on the definition of the protected characteristic of sex in the Equality Act 2010, end quote. The page also contains a short summary of Baroness Faulkner's thoughts, made up of a few quotes taken from her reply letter, sent on the 3rd of April, with her asserting that changes to the Equality Act could bring greater clarity to the law, laying down how they could go about introducing said changes, and stating that they looked forward to doing so, yet realize the decision ultimately rests with the government. This worried a lot of people, and those fears would only continue to grow as they read the two letters. Starting with a letter by Kemi Badenoch, it opens by stating, quote, in our meeting on the 12th of January, we discussed the increasing contestation of how the term sex is understood in law and in practice. Recent cases in both the English and Scottish courts have raised legitimate questions about the definition of sex in the Equality Act 2010. End quote. It's worth noting that both cases cited involved anti-trans hate groups, Fair Play for Women and For Women Scotland, both of which are funded in part by far-right evangelical lobbies from the US, such as the Alliance Defending Freedom and the Heritage Foundation, lobbies which seek the total eradication of both LGBT+ people and abortion access worldwide. They are fake grassroots movements, often referred to as astroturfed movements. The letter then goes on to reference the use of Section 35 to block the Scottish Gender Recognition Reform Bill to assert that, alongside the previous cases, it somehow draws into question the operation of the Equality Act. This is in spite of the previously established fact that a GRC is not needed for a trans person to be protected under the Equality Act, meaning the Scottish Gender Recognition Reform Bill was of zero consequence to it. The Minister for Women and Equalities would have known this had she bothered to look up the EHRC's very own page on the Equality Act. Sadly, Baroness Faulkner's letter isn't much better, with her responding to the suggestion to change the definition of sex in the Equality Act to biological sex with, quote, there is no straightforward balance, but we have come to the view that if sex is defined as biological sex for the purpose of the Equality Act, this would bring greater legal clarity in 8 areas, end quote. Now, of the 8 areas the Baroness claims would be given greater legal clarity, which are pregnancy and maternity, freedom of association for lesbians and gay men, freedom of association for women and men, positive action, occupational requirements, single-sex and separate-sex services, sport, and data collection, not a single one of these stands up to basic scrutiny. When it comes to pregnancy and maternity, Baroness Faulkner asserts, quote, as things stand, protections in the Equality Act for pregnant women and new mothers fail to cover trans men who are pregnant and whose legal sex is male. Defining sex as biological sex would resolve this issue, end quote. A problem with this is that the vast majority of trans men do not wish to be referred to using feminine terms, which is why they have fought so long and hard to have institutions like the NHS use gender-inclusive language, such as pregnant people, and update their systems to be fit for purpose. Many trans men opt to legally change their gender in spite of the fact that, as things currently exist, this often comes at the cost of adequate healthcare, not just relating to pregnancy, but also things such as cancer screenings. Yet the anguish caused by constantly being misgendered and openly dehumanized, as the Baroness is suggesting here, is seen by many to be greater than the potential risk of dying from cancer. That's how strong their conviction is, yet Baroness Faulkner seeks to overrule that without actually consulting trans men. This is in spite of the fact that there are other solutions to this problem that do not undermine the dignity of all trans people, trans men included. The Baroness seems to be set on taking the most harmful route possible, as is the case with many of her examples. Moving on to the freedom of association for lesbians and gay men, Baroness Faulkner asserts, quote, if sex means legal sex, then sexual orientation changes on acquiring a GRC. Some trans women with a GRC become legally lesbian, and some trans men with a GRC become gay men. As things stand, a lesbian support group, for instance, may have to admit a trans woman with a GRC attracted to women without a GRC or to trans women who had obtained a GRC. On the biological definition, it could restrict membership to biological women." End quote. This is quite literally the definition of discrimination. These support groups have no more right to exclude trans lesbians than they do black lesbians, disabled lesbians, or Muslim lesbians. This also feeds the narrative that there is a rift between cis lesbians and trans women, when in reality 96% of lesbians, the highest of any LGBT+ demographic, excluding trans people themselves, support or heavily support trans people, including trans women. In fact, the lies Baroness Faulkner is falling back on have been called out by cis lesbians as being lesbo-misic tropes which have caused their community incredible harm. Then we have the facts that a GRC is not required for any of this, meaning Baroness Faulkner is once again spreading active disinformation by pretending like it is in bringing it up. There's also the invention of this idea of a legal gay and a legal lesbian, a concept that does not exist and is an outright draconian thought that seeks to fracture the LGBT+ community. The government, just like everyone else, has no right whatsoever to dictate your sexuality, and the idea that the government should have this ability is frankly terrifying to me, but is what is being forwarded here. Moving on to freedom of association for women and men, Baroness Faulkner asserts, quote, "As things stand, a woman's book club, for instance, may have to admit a trans woman who had obtained a GRC. On the biological definition, it could restrict membership to biological women." End quote. Again, much like before, this is the very definition of discrimination. It's also such an absurd example. Like, why would a trans woman being trans have any impact on her ability to read? We also see the same lie that a GRC is required to access women's spaces at current. It is not. This has been ruled on. Single-sex spaces cannot deny you access on the basis that you lack a GRC. Do you now see what I mean in how this would be important throughout this topic? Moving on to positive action, Baroness Faulkner asserts, quote, "Currently, trans women with a GRC could benefit from women-only shortlist and other measures aimed at increasing female participation. Trans men with a GRC could not. A biological definition of sex would correct this perceived anomaly." End quote. Again, no evidence is provided that trans men wish to fill women's roles. Furthermore, just like reproductive health, a simple solution to this would be to create similar shortlists for trans people who also suffer educational, employment, and economic discrimination. Whilst I don't have any UK statistics, a US report found that both trans men and non-binary people earned 70 cents to the dollar, whilst trans women earned 60 cents to the dollar, which is a trend likely mirrored in the UK. Moving on to occupational requirements, Baroness Faulkner asserts, quote, "Employers are sometimes permitted to restrict positions to women or to men. An employer can, for example, require that a warden in a woman or girls hostel be female. At present, such a role would be open to trans women with a GRC, but not to a trans man with a GRC. A biological definition of sex would correct this perceived anomaly." End quote. The problem here is that this is based on the outdated assumption that A, all cis women are heterosexual, and B, cis women do not or cannot sexually assault people, both of which are false. Case in point, I was raped as a 6-year-old child inside a woman's only domestic violence refuge. The assumption that women are intrinsically safe is what allows a great deal of sexual violence to go undetected. That said, there is arguably a cultural norm aspect to all this in that women are simply used to cis women holding certain positions in certain jobs, but the same can be said about those women being heterosexual and or white. It would be discrimination to exclude a cis lesbian or a cis woman of colour from a woman's position on the prejudicial belief that they are intrinsically dangerous, just as it is for trans women. A women's position must be open to all women, save for individual cases in which said woman is shown to be a danger to others, whether they are cis or trans. The same applies to the Baroness's next point on single-sex and separate-sex services. I won't get too much into that, other than to state that, in the decades since trans women were legally guaranteed access to women's spaces, not a single rape crisis centre or domestic violence refuge in the UK has reported any incident. That is why many of these services go out of their way to advertise themselves as trans-inclusive, because they're there to help people and not demonize victims of rape and abuse as Baroness Faulkner is doing here in her letter. This has sadly resulted in such services being attacked by the Baroness's supporters, as we saw last year when anti-trans bigots attacked the Survivors Network, demanding that they throw a trans woman who was a known victim of rape out onto the streets, a demand said service thankfully rejected. Moving on to sport, Baroness Faulkner asserts, quote, "At present, to exclude trans women with a GRC from women's sports, the organiser must show that it was necessary to do so in the interest of fairness or safety. A biological definition of sex would mean that organisers could exclude trans women from women's sports without this additional burden." End quote. So Baroness Faulkner quite literally seeks to exclude trans women without due process, meaning an organiser doesn't have to demonstrate that trans people are a danger to cis women, they can just choose to discriminate against them anyway. It is horrific to see just how open Baroness Faulkner is about her desire to hurt trans people, trans women in particular, even when the evidence does not support her assertions. We also see the final mention of the GRC, which I've just taken to ignoring at this point since you all know by now that it is not required to access gendered services. The last point we have is data collection, with Baroness Faulkner asserting, quote, "When data are broken down by legal not biological sex, the result may seriously distort or impoverish our understanding of social and medical phenomena. A biological definition of sex would require public bodies like universities to apply this category without the complexity added by a legal definition of sex to the analysis of data collected in fulfilling the public sector equality duty." End quote. If only there was a way around that, such as asking whether the person answering is trans or cis, without undermining the legitimacy of said gender or their right to be treated with dignity and respect. Oh wait, there is. Just ask whether they are trans or cis as a separate question. We already do this with ethnicity due to the experiences of, say, black women differing greatly to that of white women. Hell, the US survey I referenced earlier did just that, offering stats for both cis and trans women as well as an ethnographical breakdown of each. What we shouldn't do is legally exclude black women from the definition of women, which is what Baroness Faulkner is forwarding here with trans women. Another thing missing from the letter entirely is the existence of intersex people and how such changes would impact them and their community. History has shown us time and time again that any effort intended to hurt trans people also hurts our intersex siblings. Biological sex is not binary, and furthermore, is completely ungovernable. The only way bigots can even attempt to police people's sex is by making uninformed judgments about their appearance, something that already happens, leading to open violence against women that disproportionately targets intersex, black and lesbian women due to Western notions of femininity having their roots quite literally in white supremacy, misogyny, and misogynar. So 8 for 8, Baroness Faulkner is spewing absolute horseshit in an attempt to pretend like such changes would offer anything outside of providing the public an excuse to discriminate against trans people. Which is why she concludes her letter with, quote, "On balance, we believe that redefining sex in the Equality Act to mean biological sex would create rationalizations, simplifications, clarity and/or reductions in risk for maternity services, providers and users of other services, gay and lesbian associations, sports organisers, and employers. It therefore merits further consideration." End quote. Except there is no balance here, merely a hatred for transgender people. The rest of the letter is just Baroness Faulkner doing the usual, spreading lies about what the Scottish gender recognition reform would mean, blowing smoke up Mr. Badnock's bigoted ass, and acting like the only people who would take issue with the legalization of discrimination against trans people in the UK are those with polarized views. Suffice to say, the public was not happy, with the petition for the government to stand with the original definition of sex used in the Equality Act picking up once again. It had 16,000 signatures on the 5th of April, the day after this news came out, and had amassed 110,000 signatures by the 7th of April, just 2 days later, and has only continued to grow since. At the time of recording this on the 12th of April, it has just passed 132,000 signatures. This means that the UK government is legally obligated to debate the proposals, and is a sign of just how much the UK public, cis women included, hate Baroness Faulkner's calls for legalised discrimination and anti-trans segregation. Yet Baroness Faulkner had the bloody nerve to run crying to the Times, claiming that it's, quote, distressing to be called transphobic scum, end quote. Have you tried not being such a raging anti-trans bigot? That'd probably help. Like, all we want is to be left the fuck alone, but you refuse to do that. You have instead chosen to publish documents that have induced terror in a marginalised community. I cannot overstate just how afraid trans people in the UK are right now. In response to the outcry, the EHRC quickly set up a meeting with members of the LGBT+ community, seeking to dispel some of the concerns people had. Yet far from doing that, all the meeting actually did was expose the incompetence at the core of the proposal. Transactional Chair Helen Belcher asked EHRC Chief Executive Marcel Boo for the definition of biological sex that had been used by Baroness Faulkner in reaching her conclusions. And rather than giving the prepared answer to what is, frankly, a very basic question, he just sat there, completely incapable or unwilling to give one. Reminder that these are the arseholes pretending to clarify what sex in the Equality Act means. Yet it only got worse for the EHRC, as Melanie Field, one of Mr. Boo's directors, stated that they were using a definition reliant on the gender marker on one's birth certificate. So the gender a person was assigned at birth, which is an administrative gender and is not biological in any way. Furthermore, the definition being used is entirely arbitrary in how it ignores later birth certificates, with birth certificates being one of the few documents a GRC actually changes, effectively nullifying any and all GRCs. That is the purpose of the proposed changes, to legally erase the existence of trans people, denying them any and all protections of the Equality Act, segregating them from their declared gender. Said changes would force trans people in the UK to choose between going out and being constantly dehumanised and discriminated against with the full support of the British government, or removing themselves from public life entirely, both of which are intended to result in extreme mental harm that will drive many trans people to suicide. A fact the bloody Baroness is certainly aware of. That is the purpose of these proposed changes: genocide via engineered suicide. The bloody Baroness wishes to create a world so bleak, so hostile to trans people, that we self-select to end our existence. At the same time, anti-trans bigots will likely take the UK government's legal violence aimed at trans people as tacit permission for them to engage in violence of their own, drawing up hit lists, assaulting and even murdering trans people in the streets. We are already slipping back regarding trans rights, with our children being singled out and murdered, something that will only get worse, not better, with these changes. That is the world the bloody Baroness is pushing for, proposals which are firmly within the realm of genocide. We are currently tilting on the precipice between steps 7 and 8 of the 10 stages of genocide, with step 9 being outright extermination, and these proposed changes would easily push us onto step 8. That is where the UK is right now regarding the lives of trans people. Thankfully, a letter from the EHRC doesn't act as a change in law, but it does set a dangerous precedent that is worrying not only to the trans community, but all marginalised groups. Just 2 months ago, the UK government assured us that there was no need to change the law, yet now seem poised to work alongside the EHRC to enact genocide. The speed at which the government has changed its public position, opening the human rights of trans people and their very lives to debate, is terrifying. It is an active reminder of why we can't become lax, even for a moment, because fascism will come a-knocking. Now, there's a lot more to say on the topic. This video actually started out as a discussion on how the Labour Party has abandoned the LGBT+ community to the mercy of the Tories, first in relation to the Scottish gender recognition reforms and then the EHRC, but was quickly overtaken by a detailed analysis of the EHRC's past and present behaviour. I might circle back around to that at a later date, though I'm a little unsure as this video has been particularly exhausting. I'll just have to see how I feel. If you appreciate what we do here and want to help out, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make our work possible. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Gert Van Voorst, Hannah Banghart, Marble Wings, Sosh Daniels, Flynn, and Higgins the Seagull. And for myself, Adita, and Levi, take care now.